At my sister's wedding, I reached for the chair with my name on it, but before I could sit, she yanked it away. My body hit the polished floor in front of 200 guests. Gasps echoed, then laughter. And Astrid, my own sister, leaned down, smirking so everyone could hear. "The floor suits you better, sis." I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I stood up slowly, adjusted my dress, and walked away in silence. But inside, my chest was burning. Not just from the fall, but from years of being the sister no one defended, no one respected. What Astrid and my parents never knew was that I wasn't just a guest at this wedding. I was the reason her groom's empire even existed. Because months before this night, I had quietly saved his company from collapse, with $20 million. And when he recognized me in front of everyone, when the truth finally shattered the lies my sister had spun, the entire wedding froze. In the next few minutes, you'll hear how one cruel act turned a celebration into a reckoning. How the girl they called too cold, too ambitious, too unwanted became the one name nobody could forget that night. So stay with me, because the moment the groom opened his mouth, nothing in that hall was ever the same again. My name is Calla Monroe. I am 38 years old, and I have spent most of my life building a career that few people in my family even understood. I worked my way up to become chief financial officer of a major investment firm. I signed contracts that carried more zeros than my father ever made in a lifetime. I bought the family house back when the bank was ready to take it. I wrote checks when tuition was due, when medical bills arrived, when life got heavy. And yet when relatives asked about me, my parents would sigh and say, "Calla's doing well, but she's still alone." That was always the refrain. My independence was not pride in their eyes, it was failure. A woman to them was only complete if she wore a ring. My sister Astrid never had that problem. She was 10 years younger, 28, and she grew up in a different household than I did. By the time she was a teenager, my sacrifices had already paved the way. She never worried about money, never heard the word no when she wanted something. She was bright, pretty, and charming, the kind of girl who knew how to bat her lashes and turn a room in her favor. While I was balancing books and building stability, Astrid was building a following online. Thousands adored her filtered photos, her curated life. At family gatherings, our parents would beam with pride as Astrid described brand deals or showed off gifts from boyfriends. They never meant to be cruel, but cruelty doesn't always wear a sharp edge. Sometimes it sounds like praise for one child and silence for the other. I remember one Thanksgiving when I slipped a check under my father's plate to cover his back taxes. My mother saw, folded it quickly, and whispered, "Astrid's bringing her new boyfriend tonight. You'll love him. He works in finance, too." That was her way of changing the subject, moving the spotlight, making sure no one lingered too long on what I had done. Astrid arrived that night glowing while I sat in the corner listening to our parents gush about her dress, her hair, her prospects. My contribution vanished like smoke. It wasn't just favoritism, it was fuel for something darker. Astrid never said it out loud, but I saw it in her eyes. She hated being compared to me. Teachers used to point out how I excelled in math while Astrid struggled. Relatives said Calla's the responsible one, Astrid's the fun one. What they thought was harmless banter dug into her like a blade. Every time my parents sighed about my single status, Astrid smiled a little brighter, as if my independence was her proof of superiority. And the closer her wedding day came, the more I could feel her restlessness. "You'll come, right?" she said when the invitations went out. "But don't dress too corporate. This isn't one of your boardrooms. I don't want you intimidating the guests." It was a joke, said with a smile. But it was also a warning. My presence was a threat she couldn't quite name. Then there was Cassian Dorn, the man she was about to marry. He was 32, a polished CEO who built a tech company from nothing. But what Astrid never told him, what she never wanted anyone to know, was that Cassian's empire had almost collapsed. He had been weeks from bankruptcy before a mysterious investor stepped in with $20 million. The only name on the paperwork was C. Monroe Holdings. He never knew who stood behind that name. He just knew he owed them everything. And here was the irony: the woman he was marrying had a sister who carried the very name on that contract. The sister everyone ignored. The sister Astrid did not want anywhere near the spotlight. My parents adored Cassian, of course. To them, he was the crown jewel. Handsome, successful, and our Astrid will never have to worry, my mother said one evening while I was quietly covering another family expense. They saw Cassian as proof that Astrid had won at life, while I was the reminder of what they thought was incomplete. What none of them realized was that Cassian and I were already tied by a bond stronger than marriage, though he didn't know it yet. My investment had saved him, and one day that truth would come to light. For now, though, the balance was tilted. Astrid stood at the center, my parents fawned over her, and I was left in the shadows. I had lived with that dynamic my entire life. But weddings have a way of forcing everything into the open. Old rivalries don't stay hidden under chandeliers and white linens. They rise, they cut. And when Astrid looked at me in those final days before the ceremony, there was a flicker in her eyes that told me she wasn't just preparing to celebrate. She was preparing to humiliate. I didn't know how far she was willing to go. Not yet. But I could feel it: the storm was coming. And when it broke, it wouldn't just be about two sisters. It would be about truth, recognition, and a secret worth $20 million. The weeks leading up to the wedding revealed more than I ever expected. While Astrid was treated like a princess, ushered from one bridal appointment to the next, I was left in the shadows, even though I had quietly written a check to cover the deposit for the very venue she would be married in. Every detail was lavished upon her: flowers imported from Italy, gowns flown in from Paris, a guest list carefully curated to impress her followers online. It was as if my parents believed this single day was the pinnacle of our family's legacy. They fussed over Astrid as though she were royalty, calling each decision monumental, as if the rest of us did not exist outside of her orbit. And me, I was asked to keep to the side, as though my role was to appear in the background and not disrupt the carefully staged picture of perfection. One afternoon, I stopped by the house during a meeting-free hour, hoping perhaps to be useful. I found my mother and Astrid bent over a long dining table covered with fabric swatches and photographs. They did not notice me at first. My mother's voice was warm, indulgent, brimming with affection as she spoke of Astrid's choices. "This shade of ivory will make you glow, darling. Cassian will barely be able to breathe when he sees you walk down the aisle." It was the kind of sweetness I had rarely heard directed at me. When she finally turned to me, her expression changed: soft pride replaced by something sharper. "Calla," she said, "don't you have work? You are always so busy." There was a pause, then a faint sigh. "Sometimes I wish you weren't so cold, so practical. You never let yourself just be a woman." I had heard versions of that before, but each time it landed like a stone in my chest. I smiled faintly, unwilling to show how deep the sting went, and excused myself with the claim of another appointment. Later, Astrid herself decided to make her position clear. We were alone in her room while she tried on one of her many dresses. She turned toward me in the mirror, her lips curled just enough to suggest sweetness, but edged with something sharper. "You'll come, of course," she said, fluffing her hair. "But just be there to show your face. Don't overdress. Don't come in looking like you're running one of your board meetings. No need to intimidate anyone." The words were honeyed, but the intent was unmistakable. She wanted me invisible, ornamental, at best, erased at worst. I held her gaze for a long moment, then simply nodded. Inside, my stomach twisted, but I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. The pattern continued. Each time I offered to help, I was redirected, told the details were handled, told my input was unnecessary. I paid for part of the catering without being asked, but my contribution was never mentioned. When the florist delivered an arrangement to my parents' home, my mother beamed as if Astrid had ordered it herself. I watched quietly as my money was turned into their glory. It was not about the money; I had more than enough. It was about the truth being constantly rewritten to place Astrid at the center and me at the margins. Still, there were small cracks I noticed, moments Astrid thought no one was watching. One evening, while I sat in the living room pretending to review paperwork, Astrid entered briskly with Cassian's phone in her hand. She glanced around, not seeing me in the corner. The phone lit up with a call, and her face shifted, the practiced smile dropping into a look of unease. She rejected the call quickly, pressing her lips together, then slipped the phone back into her pocket as if she had never touched it. Her eyes darted toward the hallway where Cassian was speaking with my father, and then she forced her bright expression back on before anyone else could see. It was a flicker, a moment so brief most would have missed it. But I had spent a lifetime reading the silences between words, the tension behind smiles. That glance told me there were secrets Astrid was trying to hide, perhaps even from her fiancé. I said nothing. That was my way. But I carried the image with me. It was not jealousy that gnawed at me. It was concern. If Astrid was entangled in something she could not control, it would not just be her downfall. It could touch Cassian, and by extension, everyone who had tied themselves to this marriage. For once, I considered warning him. But then I thought of the way my mother looked at me, the way Astrid reminded me to stay in my place. And I closed my mouth. There are moments when silence is self-preservation, even if it is also a kind of betrayal. The more I watched, the more I felt myself drifting into the role of an outsider within my own bloodline. At dinners, my parents spoke as though Astrid's wedding were the greatest achievement our family could boast. My accomplishments were left unspoken, dismissed as cold facts. One evening, my father raised a glass and said, "To Astrid and Cassian, proof that love and tradition are still alive in this family." The implication was as sharp as a knife. Calla, with her career and her single life, was the exception, not the example. I forced a smile, raised my own glass, and let the words settle heavy in the pit of my stomach. Each of these moments was a pebble dropped into water, creating ripples that widened and deepened the rift between us. They thought I was immune, armored by logic and work. What they never understood was that I felt everything, I simply chose not to show it. But silence has its limits. And though I did not yet know it, the day would soon come when Astrid would no longer be content with words and glances. She would reach for something more public, something designed to break me before the eyes of strangers. That knowledge was not yet in my mind, but the seeds were planted. Every remark, every dismissal, every flicker of secrecy was leading us to that moment when the world would see what kind of family we really were. On the day of the rehearsal dinner, the seating chart was finally unveiled. Guests gathered around the large easel propped at the entrance of the hall, their eyes tracing the rows of names written in flowing script. I stepped closer, searching for mine with a small spark of hope, though by then I should have known better. Astrid's name sat prominently in the center beside Cassian's, ringed by our parents and Cassian's family. I scrolled down with my gaze line by line, until finally I found Calla Monroe tucked into the far corner at table 23. It was a table reserved for acquaintances, colleagues of my father's who hardly knew me, and distant relatives from out of town who wouldn't remember my name the next morning. It was a deliberate exile written in ink for everyone to see. I stood in silence, staring at the chart, the edges of the letters blurring slightly as my chest tightened. I reminded myself it was just a seat, a piece of furniture with a number attached. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a message: you are not part of the family center, you are not meant to be seen. Later that evening, as cameras were set up for the first round of family photographs, the photographer read from a list Astrid had prepared. Parents of the bride and groom, grandparents, siblings. I took a step forward, smoothing my dress, but then I noticed the sheet of paper in his hand. My name wasn't there. He glanced up at me, polite but confused. "I don't see you listed, ma'am. Perhaps you're with the extended family shots." He meant no harm, but the words sliced all the same. Extended family. That was what I had become. Astrid arrived then, radiant and flushed from the attention her laughter carrying across the room. She saw me standing uncertainly at the edge of the group and walked over, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Oh, Calla," she said brightly, her tone sugar-coated but her eyes sharp. "Don't look so surprised. Most of the guests don't even know who you are. It's less awkward this way. You don't want people whispering, do you?" She tilted her head, feigning concern, then added in a lower voice, "Only I could hear." It's better this way. The floor is yours, somewhere else, not here. I stared at her words, trembling on the edge of my tongue, but I swallowed them down. For a moment, I thought of all the times I had been there for her when no one else was. The nights she called me in college, panicked over late tuition, and I wired the money before she even had to ask. The day she wanted a down payment for her first apartment, and I signed the check without hesitation. The time our father's debts nearly swallowed the family whole, and I worked weekends to cover the difference. Each memory rose like smoke, clouding my vision, pressing against the silence that had become my shield. I had never once thrown those sacrifices in her face. I had given because she was my sister, because family was supposed to mean something. Yet here she was erasing me with a single line, "Guests don't know you. Better to be invisible." The photographer cleared his throat, gently uncomfortable with the tension. My parents were already arranged at the front, smiling as if nothing were amiss. My mother waved me off with a quick flick of her hand, the same gesture she used when brushing crumbs from a table. "Let them finish, Calla," she said softly, though her eyes didn't meet mine. "We'll do a picture later." But there was no later. I knew it, and so did Astrid. So I stepped back. I folded my hands in front of me and let the camera flash without me. Astrid leaned into Cassian, radiant, as the bulbs popped her veil, catching the light. My parents stood proud, their faces etched with joy. And I, for the 1,000th time, was the shadow just out of frame. As the laughter swelled around me, I forced myself to breathe steadily, to remind myself that worth was not measured by where one stood in a photograph. Yet inside, a quiet anger burned. Not the kind that demanded shouting or confrontation, but the kind that remembered. The kind that carved each slight into stone. After the session ended, Astrid passed me again, pausing briefly to murmur, "Don't take it personally, Calla. You were never really part of this picture anyway." She smiled sweetly for the guests nearby, who chuckled at some harmless joke she tossed into the air, but her words clung to me like frost. That night alone in my hotel room, I looked at the program left on the desk. My name was nowhere inside. Sponsors family bridal party, line after line, and yet I was absent. As though my years of sacrifice, my silent support, my very presence had been erased. I folded the booklet closed and placed it neatly beside the lamp. For the first time, I let myself admit what I had long suspected in Astrid's world. I was not a sister. I was an inconvenience. And tomorrow she intended to make that perfectly clear no matter who was watching. The sting of exclusion sharpened something inside me. It reminded me that silence, though powerful, had its limits. I would endure, but I would not forget. And when the moment came, because I knew it was coming, I would rise even if they preferred me hidden in the shadows. The reception hall glittered with chandeliers that spilled light over tables draped in white linen and crystal glasses. A hush of elegance lingered in the air, broken only by the low hum of a string quartet and the polite chatter of 200 guests. I walked slowly along the aisle of tables, following the neat row of name cards, until I found mine. The small card bore my name in the same looping script as everyone else's, but the chair behind it was the only thing in the room that seemed to belong to me. I reached for it, intent on claiming my small space in a day that had already made me invisible. Just as I began to lower myself, the chair slid back sharply. In an instant, the ground disappeared beneath me. My knees gave way and I fell hard onto the polished floor. The sound echoed through the vast hall like a crack of thunder, snapping conversations into silence. For one breathless moment, the world stopped. Then a ripple of shocked gasps gave way to stifled laughter. I looked up dazed and saw Astrid standing over me. Her fingers still gripped the chair, her smile poised and cruel. She bent down so only I could hear, though the venom in her voice carried farther than she intended. "The floor suits you better, sis." The words hit harder than the marble beneath me. Around us, people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or avert their eyes. Some did both. My parents sat motionless at the head table, their expressions unreadable, their silence louder than any rebuke. No hand reached out to help me. No one stood. The humiliation was total crafted to be as public as possible, and she had succeeded. I could have cried. I could have lashed out, shouted, demanded respect. But I had lived too long in the shadow of my sister's theatrics to give her that satisfaction. So I pressed one palm to the cold marble, gathered myself, and rose slowly. Every muscle ached, but I straightened my shoulders as if nothing had happened. I brushed off my dress with steady hands, the gesture as deliberate as it was defiant. The whispers that circled the room swelled, then faltered as the guests realized I would not crumble. Astrid tilted her head, expecting a scene, perhaps a retort that she could spin into further drama. When none came, a flicker of frustration crossed her face. She had wanted to reduce me to tears, to strip me of dignity, to mark me forever as the sister who belonged on the ground. Instead, I stood before her unbroken, and in that silence, she lost more than she gained. I turned, adjusted my dress once more, and walked toward the doors. Each step was measured, the heels of my shoes clicking firmly against the floor. The chatter resumed in low murmurs, but I didn't look back. I knew my parents had chosen silence, that Astrid had chosen cruelty, and that the guests had chosen comfort over conscience. That was enough to tell me where I stood, not in the family circle, not even in the crowd, but alone. Inside my chest, something shifted. For years I had endured the small dismissals, the quiet erasures, the subtle reminders that I was not what they wanted me to be. I had shouldered their debts, their needs, their silences, believing that family demanded sacrifice. But as I crossed the threshold of that hall, I knew a line had been drawn. This was not just another slight to be endured. This was the moment the mask was torn away. The cold air of the corridor met me as I stepped outside, sharper than the chill of marble against skin. I inhaled deeply, steadying myself. My hands still trembled, not from weakness, but from restraint. I would not let them see me undone. Astrid had pushed me to the floor, and my parents had let me fall, but I had risen. That truth mattered more than their silence, more than their laughter. As the doors swung closed behind me, muffling the sounds of music and chatter, I knew this was the breaking point. The years of patience, of swallowing pride, of hoping for acknowledgement, they ended here. I had endured enough. Whatever came next, I would no longer stand quietly in the shadows, waiting for a place at the table. My dignity would no longer be something they could pull away like a chair. That night, I left the reception hall not as the forgotten daughter or the overshadowed sister, but as a woman who finally understood that silence was no longer strength. It was surrender, and I was done surrendering. I lingered in the corridor longer than I intended, letting the chill of the night air cool the heat in my chest. The echoes of laughter and hushed whispers from the reception still pressed against my ears. I needed a moment, some quiet, before I returned to my seat, or chose to leave altogether. But as fate would have it, my path crossed with a truth I hadn't expected. I pushed open the door to the restroom, the dim light spilling over the tiled floor, and paused when I heard voices drifting from the far stall. It was Blair. My closest friend, the one who had stood beside me through years of late nights, heartbreaks, and family disappointments. Her voice was unmistakable, light and quick, the cadence I had always found comforting. Only now it carried a tone that cut like glass. She really does think she's better than everyone, Blair was saying. Always so polished, always so serious. It's exhausting. Honestly, Astrid did everyone a favor tonight. Calla belongs on the floor, not at the table. Who does she think she is, acting like some queen when she's just... Her words trailed into laughter, joined by another voice I didn't recognize. I stood frozen, the door still half open, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment I thought I had misheard, that perhaps it was someone else. But then Blair spoke again, clearer this time, and there was no mistaking her. I told Astrid I'd help spin the story online. People love a dramatic bride, and if I play it right, maybe I'll finally get the following I deserve. I mean, Astrid promised she'd feature me in her next campaign. That kind of exposure is worth more than any friendship. The words landed heavier than Astrid's cruelty ever had. With Astrid, I expected jealousy, malice dressed up as charm. But Blair. She had been the one I called when the silence in my apartment felt too heavy, when I needed someone to remind me I was more than a bank account and a resume. She had been the one who insisted she admired me, that she valued my strength. And now, behind a thin wall, she had revealed the truth. I stepped back quietly, careful not to make a sound, though my heart pounded so loudly I feared it would give me away. I slipped out the door and leaned against the cool wall of the hallway, staring at the patterned carpet as if it might anchor me. The betrayal burned in a way that Astrid's pettiness never could. My sister's cruelty was almost predictable, but Blair's disloyalty cut deeper because it was unexpected, unearned. Memories flickered through my mind like a cruel montage. The nights Blair and I stayed up drinking cheap wine, her promising that real friends never needed to pretend. The time she held my hand through a difficult meeting with investors, telling me I was the strongest woman she knew. The afternoons she spent in my apartment laughing about Astrid's shallow posts and mocking the very world she now seemed desperate to join. All of it now felt tainted, revealed as a script she abandoned the moment a brighter stage appeared. I pressed a hand against my stomach as though the ache might settle if I held it still. But the ache was deeper than that. It was the realization that perhaps I had no one. Not my parents, not my sister, and now not even my friend. I could have marched back in, confronted her, demanded an explanation. But what would it change? The words were said, the truth revealed. Confrontation would only feed her excuses, and I had no interest in hearing them. Instead, I walked back toward the ballroom, my steps steady, even though my chest felt hollow. I slipped into the far corner, unnoticed, my place already cleared by waiters, who assumed I had left for good. I sat quietly watching the glow of the chandeliers ripple across the glasses, the sound of forks tapping against plates, the laughter that carried on as though nothing had happened. The world spun on, indifferent to my pain. And in that silence I made a vow to myself. I would not let Astrid's cruelty define me. I would not let my parents' neglect reduce me. And I would not let Blair's betrayal shape my worth. None of them had the power to name me, to determine my value. That right belonged to me alone. I straightened in my seat, letting my breath steady. I had been pushed down, mocked, and erased. I had been betrayed by blood and by friendship. Yet here I was, still standing, still breathing, still unbroken. They could laugh, they could whisper, they could erase me from programs and photographs. But they could not erase the truth of who I was. The night was not over, and I sensed something greater still waited to unfold. If Astrid thought she had won by forcing me to the floor, she had miscalculated. Because what she didn't realize was that the more they tried to push me out, the stronger my resolve became. This was no longer about their approval. This was about reclaiming my dignity in a room that thought it could strip it away. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the noise wash over me like waves. The sting of Blair's words would not fade quickly, but it would not destroy me. I was more than their whispers, more than their betrayals. And one day soon, they would all see the truth, whether they wanted to or not. When I returned to my corner seat, the clinking of glasses and the music of the quartet filled the air as if nothing had happened. The world around me carried on, oblivious to the bruise blooming on my shoulder or the ache in my chest. I thought I could disappear there unnoticed and simply wait for the night to end. But the truth was already slipping beyond the walls of the hall. Someone had been filming. A guest phone in hand caught the exact moment Astrid yanked the chair, and I fell hard to the floor. Within minutes, the video was uploaded to TikTok, its caption a gleeful exaggeration. Bride pulls savage stunt on Sister 200, guests gasped. The footage spread like fire through dry grass, carried by algorithms far faster than whispers in the room. By the time dessert was being served, a group of younger guests at a nearby table were already huddled over a phone, stifling laughter, then glancing at me with eyes wide from something they had just seen. My stomach tightened. I pretended not to notice, but unease prickled under my skin. I excused myself quietly and stepped into the hallway where the light was dimmer and the chatter dulled. Pulling out my own phone, I hesitated, then opened the app. The clip had already gathered thousands of views in less than an hour. My name wasn't tagged, but my face was unmistakable. I watched it once, bracing myself. The fall looked worse on screen than it had felt in the moment. The collective gasp of the guests, the silence that followed Astrid's triumphant smirk as she bent toward me, it was all captured, immortalized. And then there I was, standing up slowly, dusting off my dress, my back straight, my face composed. No tears, no shouting, just dignity in the face of humiliation. The comments streamed faster than I could read them. That bride is cruel. Who does that to her own sister? This woman fell but stood up like a queen. The floor didn't deserve her. Imagine marrying someone while treating your family like dirt. A few jokes peppered in light-hearted cruelty about weddings and family drama, but most were indignant outraged on my behalf. My first instinct was panic. The thought of millions of strangers watching me stumble across a marble floor made me want to vanish. My reputation was built on precision, on control. I had spent years ensuring my name meant competence and strength in boardrooms full of men who doubted me. Now here I was turned into a spectacle, a meme, a hashtag. I considered calling the guest who posted it, demanding it be taken down. But the more I scrolled, the more my perspective shifted. The comments weren't mocking me. They were condemning her. They saw the cruelty for what it was. They saw the composure I had forced myself to maintain, and they admired it. For once, I didn't need to explain, to defend, to prove. The truth was visible without my words. The video itself was my witness. It was raw, undeniable, stripped of all the narratives my family had always used to paint me as cold, difficult, unworthy. Here, strangers saw me rise, not crumble. I stood in the hallway, the glow of the phone casting light across my hands, and I realized something unexpected. I no longer feared the exposure. Let them watch. Let them share it. Let them comment. Let them dissect it 1,000 ways. Because in every replay Astrid revealed herself, and I revealed myself too. She showed her cruelty. I showed my strength. When I slipped my phone back into my purse, my heart was steadier. The fear that had knotted in my stomach was unraveling, replaced by a quiet resolve. If my family insisted on silencing me, if my sister wanted to humiliate me, then this accidental recording was my chance to let the world see me without filters, without explanations. I walked back into the ballroom, the music swelling, laughter bubbling as though nothing had changed. But something had. The whispers online were louder than the whispers in the room, and I sensed it was only the beginning. The stage Astrid had claimed for herself was slipping from her grasp, and the light was beginning, however faintly, to fall on me. Cassian had spent most of the evening caught between the obligations of a groom and the gnawing unease he felt at the edges of the celebration. Astrid had laughed off the incident with her sister as though it were a harmless prank, urging guests back to their meals, brushing aside the murmurs that lingered in the air. Yet when Cassian glanced toward the far side of the hall where Calla sat in deliberate silence, he felt something unsettled stir in him. It wasn't pity exactly. It was recognition of dignity in the face of humiliation, a composure he had seen in far different settings, usually across negotiating tables where strength mattered more than charm. As he lifted a glass to thank a cluster of guests, his eyes caught on the chain around Calla's neck. A small gold pendant shaped like a phoenix glinted under the lights. The Firebird's wings curved upward, identical to a logo he had stared at countless times across legal contracts and wire transfers, C. Monroe Holdings. He felt his pulse skip. That symbol was not common, not a design one picked up in a boutique. It was the emblem of the fund that had saved his company from collapse, the very mark of the mysterious backer who had injected not 1 but 3 rounds of capital when every other investor had turned away. He tried to shake the thought. Perhaps it was coincidence, a gift, or a trinket. Yet the name itself gnawed at him, Monroe. Astrid's surname. Calla's, too. He excused himself from the table, retreating to the edge of the room where his phone lay charging. Fingers tense, he opened the secured portal used to manage investor relations. He pulled up the ledger of emergency financing from 2 years earlier. 3 tranches, $20 million in total. Each was listed under C. Monroe Holdings. The corporate shell had no photos, no personal biography, only a symbol in the header, a firebird rising from ash. His eyes darted back to Calla across the hall. She adjusted her dress, the pendant catching again in the chandelier light. He felt his chest tighten. Could it really be her? He scrolled further through the documents, tapping open the section that listed managing partners. The name appeared clearly, though he had skimmed over it before without pausing. Calla E. Monroe. It had been there all along. His throat went dry. He looked again toward Astrid, radiant at the head table, basking in the glow of attention, and the truth crashed into him with brutal clarity. Calla, the sister who had been pushed to the floor, was the one who had lifted him when his own empire had nearly collapsed. She was the silent force behind his survival, the investor whose faith had allowed him to keep his employees, his reputation, his future. And Astrid had never breathed a word. She had looked him in the eye, played the role of doting fiancé, and let him believe she was the one connected, the one bringing stability. He had assumed her confidence came from some invisible resource. Now he understood it had come from her sister's shadow-borrowed light she never acknowledged. Cassian's stomach turned. He remembered the nights of desperation when he had stayed awake in his office staring at the dwindling cash flow, wondering if he would have to sell everything he had built. The relief that flooded him when the first transfer appeared, the gratitude he vowed he would one day repay when he discovered who had extended such faith. That vow had shaped him, kept him steady as he rebuilt. And now, in the midst of champagne and laughter, he realized his debt stood not to his bride, but to the woman her family treated as invisible. He glanced again at Calla. She sat with her back straight, her face calm as though the cruelty she endured had left no mark. She did not know he was watching, did not know that recognition had finally found its way to him. His gaze flicked back to Astrid, and for the first time he saw not charm, not beauty, but manipulation. The way she had steered conversations, always framing her family in terms that cast her sister aside. The way she avoided details whenever the subject of finances arose. She had hidden the truth not just from him, but from everyone, because the truth threatened her carefully curated role as the star. Cassian's hands clenched around the phone. He felt the sting of betrayal deepen. It wasn't simply that Astrid had failed to tell him. It was that she had chosen deceit, actively erasing her sister's contribution to maintain her own illusion. That decision cut deeper than any petty cruelty he had witnessed in the hall. It meant she was willing to build her marriage, their future, on a lie. The weight of it pressed on him as he closed the screen. Around him, the laughter of the guests rang hollow. For the first time all night, he felt no pride in the celebration, no joy in the toasts or the music. All he felt was the gravity of the truth, the shift of loyalty in his own heart, and the growing certainty that this night meant to be the beginning of everything had instead unveiled a fault line that could not be ignored. Across the room, Calla reached for a glass of water, the pendant at her neck flashing once more. The phoenix, a symbol of rebirth, of survival against all odds. Cassian could not look away. He realized he owed her not only his gratitude but his honesty, and that realization would change everything. Cassian sat at the head table, the laughter of guests washing around him like distant waves, but his focus had narrowed to the truth now burning in his chest. He could not sit quietly any longer, not when the woman who had once saved everything he had built was being treated as if she were nothing. His eyes swept across the room, catching sight of Calla in the far corner, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. The pendant at her throat gleamed under the chandeliers, a silent testimony that demanded acknowledgement. His grip tightened on the microphone in front of him. He rose to his feet. The chatter in the hall softened, automatically guests expecting another polished toast, another story meant to flatter the bride and amuse the crowd. Cassian let the silence stretch just long enough for attention to gather. Then he turned his gaze fixed not on Astrid, but on Calla. His voice carried across the room, firm and clear. "Miss Monroe," he said the words deliberate, each syllable cutting through the hum of the room. "You're the one who saved my $20 million company, aren't you?" For a heartbeat, the hall seemed to stop breathing. The quartet faltered mid-note. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Every head turned in unison toward the corner table where Calla sat. The camera from the livestream crew stationed discreetly until now swung sharply to capture her face, broadcasting her stunned composure to every screen where friends and strangers watched from afar. Astrid's smile stiffened her hand, gripping the edge of the tablecloth as if she could hold the room together by force of will. Her parents shifted in their seats, confusion flickering into alarm. The silence deepened, stretching taut until the weight of it pressed on every chest in the room. Calla did not rise immediately. She looked at Cassian, her eyes steady though her pulse hammered in her throat. She had not asked for this spotlight, had not sought recognition here of all places. But now the truth had been spoken aloud, undeniable. Slowly she placed her hands on the table, stood, and let the eyes of 200 guests rest fully on her. She did not confirm nor deny, only held her silence with the same composure she had held when she rose from the floor earlier that evening. From the back of the hall, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was hesitant, uncertain, but it broke the spell of stillness. Another joined, then another. A ripple of applause moved through the room, not jubilant but reverent, as if the guests realized they had been part of something shameful and were only now remembering what dignity looked like. Among the murmurs came a whisper that carried farther than it should have spoken by a woman at the next table. "So she's the one. She's the truly brilliant Monroe." The words spread in a hush, repeated and rephrased until the air itself seemed to buzz with it. Astrid's cheeks flushed crimson. She tried to laugh, to wave it off as a misunderstanding, but her voice faltered, drowned by the weight of recognition shifting away from her and onto her sister. Their mother leaned toward her, whispering frantically, but even she could not mask the unease in her eyes. For years they had dismissed Calla, diminished her contributions as though success outside marriage meant nothing. Now, in a single declaration, that narrative had unraveled in front of their entire world. Cassian lowered the microphone slowly, but his gaze remained locked on Calla. Gratitude burned in his expression, tempered by guilt that he had not recognized her sooner. He had spent months preparing for this wedding, promising himself he was building a life on truth. And yet the truth had been hidden in plain sight, ignored because it was inconvenient to those who wanted the spotlight elsewhere. Calla inclined her head slightly, a gesture not of pride, but of quiet acknowledgement. She had no need to claim credit, not here. The truth was already alive in the room, undeniable, carried on the voices of those who had just hours before laughed at her fall. And in their silence now, in their applause, she felt something shift inside her. This humiliation had been meant to erase her. Instead, it had revealed her. The chandeliers glittered above, but it was Calla who held the room's attention. And though she stood alone, she no longer felt invisible. The room was still heavy with the silence that followed Cassian's declaration when he lifted the microphone again. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now, the kind of tone that cuts through ceremony and exposes what others would rather keep hidden. "There's something else," he said, his eyes fixed not on Calla this time, but on Astrid. The bride shifted in her seat, her painted smile faltering, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. Guests leaned forward, sensing that the night was no longer about toasts or laughter, but about truth. Cassian inhaled once, then let the words fall with deliberate weight. "Astrid once sent confidential files from my company to a competitor. It was Calla who covered the fallout quietly without ever asking for credit." A murmur spread like a shockwave across the hall. Some gasped outright, others whispered harshly into their neighbors' ears. Astrid's face drained of color, then flushed hot red. She shook her head quickly, forcing a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice higher than usual. "Why would I ever?" But Cassian cut her off, his tone sharper now. "Because you wanted me to fail. You wanted control. And you thought if Calla couldn't salvage the mess, you'd prove she wasn't capable of helping anyone. Isn't that true?" His words hung in the air like a verdict. Astrid opened her mouth, then closed it again, no denial finding purchase against the force of his conviction. Calla stood silently, her face composed though inside her chest ached with recognition. She had known pieces of this truth, had seen the signs, but never spoken them aloud. The late-night calls she had received from Cassian's legal team, the frantic scramble to contain the breach, the silence she chose afterward to protect her family's dignity, it all returned with brutal clarity. She had never revealed Astrid's role, believing that mercy was the kinder path. And now, under the bright light of chandeliers and live-stream cameras, that mercy had ended. The weight of the revelation settled hardest on Astrid's shoulders. She rose halfway from her chair, trembling with the effort to keep composure, but the eyes of 200 guests pinned her in place. Her father shifted uncomfortably. Her mother whispered her name as if coaxing her back into the seat. But there was no shield strong enough to soften what had just been spoken. Then a new voice rose, firm and resolute, carrying from near the front of the room. It was Cassian's mother. She stood her posture tall, her voice carrying the authority of a woman long accustomed to commanding respect. "Enough," she said, her eyes fixed on Astrid. "Our family will not join itself to betrayal. We do not welcome deceit into our home. My son will not marry someone like you." The words struck with the force of final judgment. No one dared interrupt. Astrid's hands shook as she clutched at the folds of her gown. Her lips moved, searching for words, but no sound came. The applause that had begun for Calla earlier had vanished into a silence colder than marble, broken only by the faint click of cameras capturing her humiliation. Through it all, Calla did not smile. She did not gloat, did not savor the moment of reversal. Her heart was heavy, not triumphant. She saw not a rival defeated, but a sister unraveling under the weight of her own envy. Astrid's choices had dug this grave long before the wedding day. Tonight merely revealed what had been hidden in shadows. Calla felt no joy in that. Only sorrow that jealousy had consumed a woman who might have chosen love, who might have chosen family. The air in the hall grew dense with shame. Guests shifted uneasily, unwilling to meet Astrid's eyes. Some muttered, others shook their heads, but no one rose to defend her now. In the corner, Calla's reflection in the glass window stared back at her, a reminder that she had carried dignity quietly, while others sought spectacle. Cassian lowered the microphone at last, his expression carved from stone. The wedding, once choreographed to perfection, now stood in ruins around them. But for the first time the truth had been spoken fully. And in that truth Calla stood taller than she ever had, not because she triumphed over her sister, but because she had refused to let betrayal define her. Inside she whispered to herself the words she could not say aloud. She pitied Astrid. And pity, not hatred, was the only gift she could still give her sister. The silence that followed Cassian's mother's condemnation of Astrid still lingered in the room like a veil no one dared touch. Astrid sat frozen, her painted smile stripped away while Calla remained standing, her hands clasped loosely before her, steady, though her heart trembled. The guests shifted uneasily in their seats, the spectacle of betrayal and revelation still crackling in the air. Then Cassian's mother moved forward. Her steps were not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate, carrying a weight that made people draw back slightly as she passed. She stopped before Calla and looked at her with eyes that had softened, though they carried authority still. "I know you," she said, her voice clear, not in accusation, but with quiet certainty. The words startled Calla more than anything else that had been said that night. She had not expected recognition here, least of all from this woman. The older woman's gaze didn't waver. "Not you directly," she continued, "but your mother. Years ago, when I had nothing, when my husband's business was teetering and we didn't know how we would manage, your mother stepped in. She didn't ask for repayment. She didn't even let me thank her properly. She simply helped as if it was the most natural thing to do." Calla felt the breath catch in her throat. Memories surged unbidden, her mother at the kitchen table late at night, writing checks she could barely afford, cooking meals for neighbors in need, carrying burdens quietly without boasting or complaint. Her mother had always said that strength wasn't in what you demanded, but in what you gave freely. To hear this now in front of hundreds of eyes was like feeling her mother's presence step into the room, unseen but undeniable. Cassian's mother's voice softened, though it carried far enough for every guest to hear. "And tonight, I see her in you. The same dignity, the same quiet strength. While others tried to humiliate you, you stood taller than them without ever raising your voice. That is your mother's spirit living through you. Do not forget it. Calla's composure cracked. The tears she had held back all evening welled and spilled before she could stop them, warm trails cutting down her cheeks. They were not tears of shame this time, nor of helplessness, but of release. For the first time in years, someone older, someone with authority spoke to her not with disdain or dismissal, but with recognition. They saw her not as the unmarried daughter, not as the sister to be sidelined, but as her mother's heir carrying a legacy of integrity. Her lips trembled as she tried to answer, but no words came. She pressed a hand lightly to her face, almost embarrassed by the emotion in front of so many. Yet the silence that filled the room now was different from before. It was not heavy with cruelty or judgment. It was reverent. Even the guests who had laughed earlier seemed humbled, reminded of something greater than spectacle. Astrid turned away, her own eyes hard, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. But Calla no longer focused on her. In that moment, her world had narrowed to the woman in front of her, to the echo of her mother's kindness resurfacing in this unexpected place. Cassian's mother reached out gently, brushing a strand of hair from Calla's face, in a gesture that was both intimate and maternal. "You do not need this family's recognition," she said quietly, though the microphone still caught her words. "You already carry something far greater, and anyone with sense can see it." The tears came freely then, but Calla did not try to stop them. She let them fall, her shoulders shaking once, then steadying. For so long she had carried herself like steel, convinced that only unyielding control could shield her from the scorn of those closest to her. Tonight that armor finally cracked, and instead of weakness, it revealed strength of a different kind. The strength to accept that she was worthy of love, of respect, simply for being who she was, and for carrying forward the quiet greatness of the woman who had raised her. The applause that rose this time was softer than before, less about spectacle, more about solidarity. It was the sound of people reminded of humanity, of family bonds that could survive cruelty when carried by grace. Calla lifted her chin slightly, meeting Cassian's mother's eyes, and whispered through her tears, "Thank you." The older woman nodded once, as if sealing a bond, then returned to her seat, leaving Calla standing taller than before. She wiped her face with the edge of her hand, no longer ashamed of her tears. For the first time that night, she felt lighter. Not vindicated, not triumphant, but at peace with herself in a way she had not felt in years. She knew her mother's spirit had not been forgotten. It lived on in her actions, and now finally someone else had spoken it aloud. That was worth more than any spotlight Astrid had ever tried to claim. The air in the reception hall was still taut with the echo of Cassian's mother's words when Calla moved toward the head table. Her steps were unhurried, each one deliberate, her heels striking the polished floor with a steady rhythm that carried farther than sound. The guests followed her with their eyes, not daring to breathe too loudly, as if any movement might break the fragile balance of what was unfolding. She reached the table where Astrid still sat trembling in her chair, her face pale and tight, the remnants of pride barely holding together the mask she had worn all evening. Calla stood for a moment in silence, her hand brushing the chain around her neck where her mother's pendant rested, drawing strength from it. Then slowly, she slid her fingers into the pocket of her clutch and retrieved the object she had carried without thought, the Monroe family ring. It was not large nor ostentatious, but it had belonged to generations passed down through their mother as a symbol of continuity. Astrid had always assumed it would be hers one day, given her status as the favored child, but Calla had been the one entrusted with it in the end. With the same composure that had carried her through every humiliation of the evening, Calla placed the ring on the white linen tablecloth. The tiny circle of gold caught the chandelier light gleaming starkly against the immaculate surface. Her voice was quiet, but it carried with a clarity that cut through the silence. "I hope one day you understand," she said, her eyes fixed on Astrid, "that honor cannot be borrowed. It cannot be taken by force or borrowed through marriage. It is something you carry in your actions, and tonight you showed the world you never had it." A murmur rippled among the guests, not cruel, not mocking, but solemn. Astrid's lips parted as if to respond, but no sound came. She stared at the ring, her hand twitching once, then freezing in her lap, unable to reach for it. Calla straightened her posture, letting the finality of her gesture hang in the air. Cassian stepped forward, then his face drawn, but his voice softer than it had been all night. "I once thought I wanted to marry Astrid," he said, his eyes searching Calla's. "But tonight I realize admiration and respect are the foundation of anything worth building. And those belong to you." His words were not romantic, not even an invitation, but a confession of truth laid bare before everyone present. Calla met his gaze only briefly, then turned her eyes back to her family. Her father's face was unreadable, his pride punctured in front of his peers. Her mother's lips were pressed tightly together, her eyes shimmering not with tears, but with the realization that the daughter she had dismissed for years stood taller now than any of them. The silence stretched oppressive, but Calla did not flinch. She wanted no apologies, no late confessions of regret. She had given too much of herself to earn what they had never been willing to see. With one last look at them, her eyes steady and unblinking, she turned on her heel. The movement was graceful, decisive, her dress swaying softly as she began walking toward the doors. Guests shifted in their seats, some whispering, others watching in quiet awe. A few stood instinctively as though acknowledging that the true dignity in the room was not leaving in defeat, but in triumph. Astrid sat paralyzed, staring at the ring that remained untouched on the table, the weight of her sister's words pressing heavier than any reprimand. Calla's parents did not move to stop her, and in that stillness, their silence became its own admission of guilt. As Calla reached the wide doors of the hall, the chandeliers glittered behind her, their light falling on her back like a benediction. She did not look back again. The echoes of her footsteps followed her into the corridor, leaving behind a hall full of people who would speak of that moment long after the flowers had wilted and the champagne had gone flat. For the first time in years, Calla felt no need to defend herself, no desire for vindication. She had not come to prove anything, and yet by the end, the truth had spoken louder than every lie. She carried nothing with her but her dignity, and that was more than enough. The city was alive with a rhythm of its own when Calla stepped out onto the balcony later that night. The hum of traffic below, the flicker of neon signs against glass towers, the distant thrum of music from bars and late-night cafes, all of it rose to meet her as if to remind her that life continued indifferent to the wreckage left behind in a single wedding hall. The cool air pressed against her skin, sharp but cleansing, carrying away the last traces of perfume and champagne that clung to her dress. She leaned on the railing, letting the night settle around her. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. The screen lit up with a new email, its subject line stark and professional. She opened it, her eyes scanning quickly, then slowing to absorb the words. "We'd like to offer you the role of global financial strategist," a position she had only once allowed herself to imagine, an opportunity that would place her at the helm of decisions rippling far beyond the narrow confines of family drama. She exhaled, the weight of it sinking in, not as pressure, but as possibility. For years, she had been the unseen hand behind numbers that saved companies, the quiet force who never asked for recognition. Now the recognition was coming uninvited, earned by the consistency of her choices, by the integrity no one in her family had cared to acknowledge. Another vibration interrupted her thoughts. This time, it was a message. She hesitated before opening it, as if already bracing herself. Cassian's name lit the screen. The words were brief, simple, yet carried layers unspoken. "I still owe you that dinner. No tux, no bride. Just you and me." She stared at the text for a long moment. The sincerity in it was unmistakable. It was not a ploy, not a desperate attempt to fill the void Astrid had left. It was gratitude, and perhaps something more, an acknowledgement that what he had admired in her tonight was not an accident, but the essence of who she was. Calla's thumb hovered over the screen, her mind running through a dozen possible replies. She could type yes, she could type no, she could leave the door half open with a single neutral line. But instead, she locked the phone and set it aside. Some decisions deserved patience, and this one was not about him. Not yet. She stepped closer to the railing, her hands wrapping around the cool metal as she looked out across the expanse of lights. The skyline stretched before her, sharp and brilliant, a testament to ambition and survival. She let her eyes follow the grid of streets, the glow of windows in apartments filled with strangers, each living their own stories of loss and resilience. For the first time in years, she felt untethered, not in the sense of being adrift, but in being free. Her thoughts turned inward, quiet and certain. All her life she had measured herself against the weight of family expectations, against the silence of recognition withheld, against the sting of being cast aside. Tonight had torn those illusions apart, not because the world had suddenly chosen to see her, but because she had chosen to stand in her own worth, regardless of who looked or who turned away. The email waited. The message lingered, but her heart was not in a rush to claim either. She whispered to herself, almost as though her mother might hear it carried on the wind, "Before I choose who walks with me, I'll choose myself." The words settled like a vow, not dramatic, not heavy, but grounding. She would not measure her future by the approval of parents who had never understood her, nor by the affections of a man only just realizing what he had overlooked. She would measure it by the life she built with her own hands, by the dignity she refused to surrender. The city lights shimmered, reflecting in her eyes as she smiled faintly. A smile that carried no bitterness, only resolve. She straightened her shoulders, inhaled deeply, and allowed the noise of the streets below to wash over her like a symphony. Tomorrow would bring decisions. Tonight, she had peace. And so she stood on the balcony, not as the woman humiliated at her sister's wedding, not as the hidden benefactor of a corporation, not as the daughter her parents dismissed. She stood as Calla Monroe, her own choice, her own strength, her own future. Whatever came next would not define her. She would define herself. And that is where Calla's story leaves us for now, standing on a balcony with the lights of the city stretching endlessly before her, choosing herself above all else. Her journey reminds us that dignity cannot be handed to you or taken from you. It is something you claim by the way you stand, even when the world tries to pull the chair from under you. If you have ever faced moments where you were underestimated, pushed aside, or made to feel small, then you know the power of reclaiming your own worth. I would love to hear your thoughts about this story. What would you have done in Calla's place? Do you think she should reply to Cassian's message, or should she continue walking her own path alone? Share your perspective in the comments below. I read each and every one of them, and your insights make these stories even more meaningful. If you enjoyed this journey and want to hear more stories filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Your support helps bring more of these stories to life, and I can't wait to have you with me in the next one.